All right, welcome everybody. This is our final webinar for the 301 series, and we're very lucky to have Chad Miller talking to us about lifelong learning today. With that, I'm going to hand it over to you, Chad, so you can get started. And I'm sure more people are going to be joining, but I'm a stickler for getting started as close to the time we said we were going to as possible. So with that in mind, take it away.
Thank you, Gary. I appreciate it. I'm just going to get this set up so that, okay, I hope you all can see my screen and I hope you all can hear me. Good
Yep.
afternoon and good morning, depending on where you're logging in from. And thanks for being here today. So I'm going to be talking about promoting lifelong learning, self-directed learning, and this is based on the chapter Continuum of Learning, Teaching Lifelong Learning Skills. And are you seeing that the closed captioning? I'll turn that off. There we go. That I wrote for the guidebook. And one of the themes that I think you'll find today is that there's still a lot of work to be done in this area. There's a lot of things we don't know, and there are a lot of research opportunities I think that we could have going forward in this arena, because there's just not a lot in the literature compared to other topics that we've discussed. So you'll hear more about that as we go through. Just a little bit more about this. I think I need to read through this. Is that right, Gary? Just the credit statements. This is for one credit of CME. You should only claim the credit with the commensurate with the extent of your participation. So thank you for being here. And then you can see how it falls under the exception one of standard 3 of the ACC standards of integrity and independence. So there you go. I have nothing to disclose. And then just a little bit on the clinical faculty development series. I think many of you have come to these before. Provide faculty development to a broader audience interested in clinical medical student education, including medical students, residents, fellows, clinical academic, and community physicians. This is a 3-year series, 9 webinars a year, CME credit, as you know, and second Thursday of the month.
Mostly.
On the guidebook for clerkship directors, the 5th edition. Here's some examples of some that have taken place. Some of you may see your names up here. Some more. I think I'm the last one, so there's no more after this. And I know mine got moved from February of last year to today. And so the chapter I'm going to focus on, and I believe it's chapter 27, Continuum of Learning, Teaching Lifelong Learning Skills. Objectives for today. Identify standard practices regarding self-directed learning during undergraduate medical training with a focus on clerkships. I want to talk a little bit about the LCME expectations of self-directed learning, and I'll tell you that we just went through a full LCME site visit at St. Louis University School of Medicine, so this is fresh in my head and relevant to what I've been doing for the last year and a half. And then we'll identify and review common obstacles to promoting self-directed learning among medical students, discuss ways to promote this, especially in the clerkship setting. And then we'll review some updates and some innovations in self-directed learning since I originally wrote this chapter a few years ago. And so just to kind of lay the groundwork here, and I'm not telling you anything you don't already know, but medical school, 4 years, residency fellowship training, 3 to 7 years, clinical practice, let's just estimate 40 years. So that's less than 20% of a physician's career that requires instructor-directed learning. And we know even within the medical school training and the residency fellowship training, a lot of that is self-directed by the learner. And so the vast majority of learning during medical school residency and during one's career is self-directed, usually away from the oversight of the instructor, of the coach. And so in some ways, it's kind of amazing that that's the case, and yet so profound. We still don't know as much about this as maybe we should. And so let me just give you a definition. I'm going to borrow from Malcolm Knowles, kind of the father of self-directed learning in some ways. Self-directed learning, a process in which the individuals take the initiative with or without the assistance of others in diagnosing their learning needs, formulating learning goals, identifying human and material resources for learning, choosing and implementing appropriate learning strategies, and evaluating learning outcomes. In summary, they take responsibility for and control of their learning. And before I get too deep into this, let's talk about the LCME. And this is element 6.3. If you for those of you who are familiar with it. And when the LCME looks at self-directed learning, not only do they pretty much engage in the Knowles definition, but there are some requirements that you need to have to meet this. And I think it's relevant to talk about right now. And in particular, the LCME focuses on the pre-clerkship curriculum because they want they want our learners to be prepared for clerkships to be able to engage in this activity so they can meet their own learning needs and identify them. And so there are 4 key components to meet the LCME 6.3 element. And we were asked a lot of questions about these, and I think we did okay on them. But first things first, learning activities in the pre-clerkship curriculum where students engage in all the following: self-assessment of their learning needs, independent identification, analysis, and synthesis of relevant information, independent and facilitator appraisal of the credibility of information sources, and they need to be assessed on and receive feedback on their information-seeking skills. So some of the keys here is that they identify their learning needs, they go get the information, they analyze it, they synthesize it, but then they need feedback on the resources that they used and the conclusions that they came to. And that's a key component to that. And that often does, at least for us at St. Louis University, comes from faculty. And so let's talk about self-directed learning in the more broad sense. And it's not that none of this is going to apply to the LCME definition, but it may supplement that. But I wanted to get that LCME definition out of the way to kind of make a distinction of that's really not what I'm here to talk about today. I'm more to focus on self-directed learning, lifelong learning, in the broad scheme of things, but I would be remiss if I didn't touch on that LCME component. So self-directed learning, this is a little bit different than a lot of things that we teach. It's not taught so much in the classic sense. And in many ways, it is a mindset as a faculty member that's required more than a curriculum. And we kind of need to absorb that mindset of a facilitator. Role modeling is real important for how we promote self-directed learning. And it also may require us to reveal more about our own approach and habits to learning than we're used to. And I think that's one of the things that maybe we didn't see. I know I didn't see when I was going through training, is someone coaching me on how they looked up information or how they did their own self-directed learning. And that's something that as we promote it, I'd like to see more faculty here, not only at St. Louis University, but across the nation do. And then in addition to this, motivation and desire by the learner are fundamental. And so as faculty, clerkship directors, there's a number of things we can do to promote self-directed learning, but ultimately the motivation and desire of the learner is key here. And there are things that are intrinsic to that are beyond our control. So where's a good place to start as to what motivates a clerkship student? Now I'm going to borrow from self-determination theory here because I think this is a good framework to think about this. Because let's be honest, motivation of clerkship students can sometimes be challenging to ascertain. So self-determination theory, so SDT, that's going to be different than SDL, self-directed learning, which I'll use that acronym a little bit as I go through the talk. But SDT boils down to 3 innate psychological needs: a sense of relatedness, a sense of autonomy, and a sense of competence. So let me go through each of these one by one. So a sense of relatedness. This is fostered by a feeling of inclusion as a member of the medical community. And as we know, clerkship students, they're very susceptible to imposter syndrome. So they have that desire to feel that they are included and they are a member. And positive role modeling is important here because clerkship students are likely to emulate behaviors and norms and a desire to fit in. So it's important as faculty, as clerkship directors, that we role model our own self-directed learning. We explain that what we do and how we do this, because it is likely those students may actually adopt what we're doing early on, especially when they're in the throes of that imposter syndrome, trying to figure out what are the norms of how I fit in. So a sense of relatedness, that's one way that learners are motivated. The other is through a sense of autonomy. Now, this is a little bit more complicated with medical students because they are not licensed to practice, as we know. But we talk about relational autonomy. This is granting opportunities for making choices when individuals demonstrate competence and trustworthiness. The EPAs, or the entrustable professional activities, are kind of rooted in that relational autonomy. But another way to do this is to encourage students to assume or adopt a mindset of having the responsibility for the decision. So what would you do in this scenario? And tell me what you think the diagnosis is without even talking to the intern or the residents, and fostering that autonomy that way. Again, still more challenging than clerkship students, but I think something that is important through SDT. And then the third component of SDT is a sense of competence. Provide opportunities for the student to display competence or demonstrate a skill. And when students feel they know something or can do something at a appropriate skill level, it's valuable to them. And a desire to be effective is something that they value at a very high level. But feedback here is also key. Provides a way for the learners to affirm their competence. So we talked about autonomy, we talked about relatedness, and we talked about a sense of competence. Now, something that may go to that sense of competence is self-assessment. Now, self-assessment, unguided, internally generated assessment. But I think something that we may want to encourage that speaks more to that sense of competence that students might be seeking that aligns with self-directed learning is self-directed assessment seeking. Individuals seeking out an external source to provide evaluation and feedback on how they're doing or on their own self-assessment. So something I do with my learners, I do actually have them self-assess how they're doing, and then I give them feedback on their self-assessment. And I think that helps calibrate their self-assessment in a way that makes them more effective, because we know that humans are notoriously poor at self-assessment. And so coaching and calibration is key to make that something useful over time. But then this self-directed assessment seeking, where they're getting evaluation and feedback, fulfills that need for that sense of competence and ultimately autonomy down the road. So self-determination theory reimagined. Kelly Skeff and Georgette Stratos at the Stanford Faculty Development Program for Clinical Teaching, they recategorized the students' motivations into the following: need-oriented, goal-oriented, and learning-oriented. So need-oriented, knowledge and skills needed for patient care. And this could be back to that relatedness, wanting to feel like they actually feel like they belong in what they're doing, but also to competence. Goal-oriented, this is definitely concrete accomplishment that someone's looking for. That goes back to that SDT competence that we're talking about. And then learning-oriented, this is a general interest of a topic, which this could go back to autonomy, having autonomy over my own learning. And I'm actually pursuing something for the learning benefit that it may give me. Now I'm going to transition to obstacles to self-directed learning for clerkship students. So we've talked a little bit about the motivation and some of the struggles there, but there are 5 obstacles identified in the chapter for the guidebook that I want to go through here: workload, cognitive load, the negative influence of peers and teachers, lack of self-directed learning skills by the teachers as well as the learners, and then even a lack of motivation amongst the learners to some degree. So workload. Something to think about here. Again, this is maybe somewhat my opinion, but I think many of you might agree with me on this. Expectations of clinical time between clerkship students and the residents should be less than the residents, but not too much less. There's a balance here, because clerkship students must learn so much more outside the clinical boards than the interns or residents, and space should be made for them in this way so they can do this. But I think there's a risk here, in that if the clerkship students are away from the team too much, or they're away from the clinic too long, they may not be seen as proper contributors to the day-to-day activities of the team. So there's a balance here, but it's something that we should be sensitive to as clerkship directors. And self-directed learning diminishes significantly if workload is too great. All right, how can you do self-directed learning when you're always doing these other things that are demands on your time? Second, cognitive load. I think this is familiar to many of you, but just a quick review. Germane load, that's the mental energy to process new information and build knowledge. Intrinsic load, the inherent difficulty in processing certain information. And then you have the extraneous load, which is the unnecessary cognitive effort because of the way something is presented or organized. And if you combine too large of a cognitive load with too large of a workload, that is something that can lead to burnout and definitely dissatisfaction with medicine. And clerkship students, they have a very large germane load because of the amount of new material they have to process, especially at the beginning of the clerkship year. And so as clerkship directors and faculty, I think we can focus on decreasing the intrinsic load and extraneous load in our approaches. And things to do that: make the schedule as simple as possible. Don't give them an unnecessary complex clerkship schedule, because that increases that intrinsic and extraneous load. I think workshops on how to manage the EMR are helpful. I know they're helpful for me to manage the extraneous load of the EMR, but they can see how it's organized and how best to access the information that is stored in the EMR. So things like that, I think, can help minimize the intrinsic and extraneous load and can be helpful to focus on as clerkship directors. Another obstacle, and we hope this is not often the obstacle, but our own teachers and peers can sometimes get in the way of self-directed learning. Back to what I said earlier, there's a lot to be learned about STL right now. And many teachers just lack STL promoting behaviors, or it's not something they've seen before, or it's not something they've chosen to prioritize. And so there in itself, teachers aren't promoting this. Now, hopefully it's a rare circumstance for everyone, but if the teacher's creating a hostile learning environment, obviously that is not something that's going to promote many learning behaviors, but definitely not the desire for a student on their own to go seek out and learn. And then we can add to the cognitive load through poor communication or unclear expectations. And that can diminish the opportunities for STL as well as other learning behaviors. And then peers not pulling their weight, because when they're not pulling their weight, that means other people need to pick up the slack, and that can also eat into the time for self-directed learning behaviors, and then adding to that hostile learning environment. Again, I hope that's a rarity for all our students, but those things can contribute as an obstacle. Then back to this lack of skills. So the learners themselves may have difficulties with personal reflection, goal generation, and even plan development. And in the study I've cited below, they were cited as major barriers to achieving learning goals for learners. And then skills for SEL are undeveloped on a large scale. And so this is a great opportunity for faculty intervention, faculty development to cultivate these skills. It's not something that I think we focus on enough. And finally, out of the obstacles, lack of motivation. And by no means do I think all these obstacles are comprehensive. There are more out there. But we know that the internal motivation to fill the knowledge gaps often does not outweigh the inertia to maintain current practice. We know that actually faculty engaging in CME activities, there's a strong tendency to seek out CME activities that reinforce what you already know, instead of seeking out CME activities that pertain to knowledge gaps or skills gaps. We talked about self-determination theory a little bit earlier, relatedness, autonomy, and competence being relevant to that motivation. And I think something else that's important here as far as promoting self-directed learning is that growth mindset, that we're not static, we can learn, we can get better, and that we can go out and seek additional information to improve our current state as a student, as a resident, as a faculty member, as an attending. So fostering that growth mindset, I think, is an important thing for this motivation obstacle that we may see. So how else might we promote SDL and overcome some of these obstacles? Well, I'm going to talk about three things: the resources that we might use, the teacher's role, and some of the teaching behaviors that we can use for self-directed learning. And so I'm not going to go through the actual resources by the students because there's so many out there, but I do think it's important that as a clerkship director, as faculty member, that we know what our students are using at our institution for our rotations. And we need to familiarize ourselves with some of those online resources like Sketchy and Pathoma and Boards and Beyond and whatever else the students may be using at that time. So as we help promote SDL behaviors, we can refer them back to the resources that we know they already have and are using. And then think about what resources we use. As an internal medicine physician, what do I use when I need to look up a clinical question? When do I look up clinical questions? How do I stay up to date on information? And from the manuscript I cited below, there's a suggestion that a good tool to promote SDL and it will have these following characteristics. It would be a good foraging tool, which would alert you to new relevant and valid information, but also a good hunting tool, which allows you to find the information once again when needed. And any application that combines those two would be excellent. So, for example, for me, I might use the New England Journal website and the Journal Watch through the New England Journal, which that Journal Watch will forage material for me, promote to me what's come out, what might be new, relevant, and valid. And I know I can go to the website and I can search the New England Journal because I can hunt through that, find what I need whenever I need it. So that's one example of many that could be out there that you could use. So what's the teacher's role of modeling, promoting SDL behavior? And I think one of the keys is aligning your teaching approach with the level of the learner. I really like Gerald Groh's stage self-directed learning model. And this table here captures this well. So you can see at the top there, different stages that a teacher or different roles a teacher may have, from authority and expert to the salesperson motivator, to facilitator, to delegator. And as you go from left to right across this table, the teacher pulls back as being the authority and as hands-on, and becomes less and less the hands-on individual. But as they go left to right, promotes more and more self-directed learning by the students. And then if you look at the column there, you can see students. You have the dependent student, the interested student, the involved student, the self-directed student. And a student may go back and forth between those stages, but the teaching approach should match where the student is. And when there's a mismatch, it can cause a lot of problems. So let me give you an example. I'm an internal medicine physician. So as residents go from their intern year to their second year, they become a senior resident on a team, where they're the resident that is leading the team. And that's their first time leading an internal medicine team. Now they have interns reporting to them, students reporting to them, and they may be more in that S2, S3 area for what it's like to run a team. And as an attending, I need to adjust my role to that more that T2, T3 role. And I'll try to stay there. But you can contrast that in maybe a third year resident who's at the end of the residency program, who's about to be an attending maybe a month from now. I'm going to take a different approach with them because they're likely going to be in that S4 teaching mindset where they're going to be pretty self-directed on their own. So my approach is going to be more on that T4 level. And that would be a match if I aligned that way with both of those learners. But let's say I tried the T4 approach with that new resident, that new second year resident who's in that S2, S3 level. That puts, again, patients at risk because I'm not hands-on enough. I'm not providing them enough guidance. And that's not going to help facilitate their learning and ultimately their goal to get that to that self-directed level. And then with that third year resident who's about to graduate, if I take a T2 or T3 approach, that may be too much hands-on. I might take away too much autonomy from them, and they really won't be able to engage in self-direct learning because I'm going to be running the show too much. And so finding that match is important. And that mismatch, I think, can cause serious consternation amongst our residents when it happens. And so I really do like this table, but I think matching your teaching to where the learner is important in promoting SDL. And as that learner grows, you back off a little bit and give them more and more autonomy. What other teaching behaviors did I include in the chapter? For clinicians, we talk about thinking out loud. I think studying out loud is an important thing to promote self-directed learning. What is it that you do when you have to study or look something up? What resources do you use? Whatever those are, share them with your learners. It's not something that I saw when I went through residency in medical school, but it is something that will promote SDL if we begin to do that. Talked about motivation a lot earlier. And yeah, it could be just as simple as asking the students what motivates them. What are they here to accomplish? And trying to align what you teach with what motivates them. Developing a learning plan with students. You can guide them on this, but when it's time for them to design their own learning plan on their own, they'll have the feedback and the input that you gave them. Give feedback when SDL behaviors are observed. And this is important to reinforce them. So a student who goes home, looks something up, uses a good resources, and maybe presents it the next day on rounds, by all means, make sure you give positive feedback to them so you reinforce that behavior. Another thing you can do is stimulate the students' thinking. Be provocative, bring up controversial topics within reason to let the students know that there's more to this. Where if they think everything is solved, or you act like everything is solved when you're on rounds or in clinic, and there's nothing else out there to look for, it's going to decrease that motivation to go look things up. But inside, bringing up the controversies in medicine and suggesting there's more things out there, more opinions out there, can help stimulate the students' thinking to go look things up on their own. And then as clerkship directors, I think it's important to create a clerkship curriculum that allows space for reflection, self-study, and development of a learning plan. And so that's something that I know when I was a clerkship director, that development of a learning plan was something that we did with every clerkship student as they rotated through. But I do, so creating space for this, I feel is very, very important. So this is where things really get challenging. How do we assess self-directed learning and whether it was successful or not? The most common practice out there that I could find in the literature is using a survey. The survey that's used by most, or most commonly used, I should say, is the Guglielminos SDL Readiness Scale. And so you can use that, do your intervention, use the scale again, and see if individuals have improved regarding the SDL readiness. But this is a tremendous opportunity to innovate and improve an assessment because there's just not much out there in the literature. And so there's a lot of room to grow here. So let's talk a little bit about what's due in self-directed learning. And I'm going to talk about two large scale reviews of SDL that have been recently published. I'm going to talk about a single site study on home task trainers. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about social media and artificial intelligence, because I think those are relevant to SDL. So this study here, published in Medical Science Educator by Yon-Sin Lim, is about supporting self-directed learning, and it was a national needs analysis. And so they sent out a survey nationally to clerkship directors, deans, a number of individuals. They got about 330 so odd responses, and they also surveyed faculty at their own institutions as well. And this is what they found. So the perceived benefits of self-directed learning, you can see strongly up there. 97.6% of respondents said this fosters the development of lifelong learning skills. Promotes self-directed self-reflection about learning, so 86.1%. And you can see a number of things that I don't think are surprising here. But as you get towards the bottom of this graph, I want to draw your attention to two areas. One of them is the benefits of self-directed learning improves academic performance. Only half of respondents thought that it did this, which that was surprising to me. In my opinion, really good self-directed learning is good. Should improve your academic performance, but only 50% thought that. And then I guess this is less surprising. As far as developing learners' communication skills, this was not something that many thought did that. Same study. This asked the perception of support for faculty development. So we think 97% think it's important, but here's what they think about the support for it. So you can see the dark box there, strongly agree, then the kind of medium gray boxes agree, and then the lighter box, neutral, disagree, strongly agree, as you go right to left there. 95% strongly agreed that self-directed learning is essential for medical student success. 91% thought instructors needed training and faculty development in order to effectively promote self-directed learning amongst their students. So back to, we think it's important, but boy, we need some training to be able to do it. And then 89% said, I would like to use more strategies that promote self-directed learning. So we think it's important, we need more training, and I would like to use that training. And then finally, the administration at my institution supports efforts to promote self-directed learning. Only 69% agreed or strongly agreed there. So that also says that at an institutional level, there is room for improvement. And so in summarizing this, faculty overwhelmingly reported that SDL is essential for medical student success. Interestingly enough, the MDs that responded to that survey, they said that they agreed at 99.1%. The PhDs were at 91.0%. But some totals, 91% of respondents felt instructors needed training in order to effectively promote self-directed learning amongst their students. And so the summary conclusion, at least in the way I read this manuscript, was despite an overwhelming belief that SDL was essential, it did not translate into the capacity to recognize the means by which to foster its development. Instructors need training faculty development in order to effectively promote SDL. The second study I want to point to is this one here. This is by Tracy Taylor. This is self-directed learning assessment practices in an undergraduate health professions education, a systematic review. And this is published in Medical Education Online. And so I just going to cut to the chase a little bit on this one. This was challenging because as they reviewed the self-directed learning practices in undergraduate medical education, they're very, very heterogeneous. And so it made it very challenging to do a systematic review when so many things were so different. And they noted that SDL activities were implemented often to meet unique learning needs, and that varied institution to institution. So that caused wide variations in reporting of SDL activities. But some of the things they could draw from the research they did was that the most common assessment was a student perception survey, followed by an internally developed knowledge exam. And they also noted that the higher quality studies tended to use more than one assessment. So they might use both the student perception survey and the internal developed knowledge exam, which suggests that maybe to assess SDL, we may need to use more than one modality to do this well. But again, this also goes back to, hey, there's not a lot out there right now on SDL and how to assess this. And then the last study I want to talk a little bit about is this one. And This one I hope speaks to some of our procedural colleagues. This is in surgery open science, and it's the development of laparoscopic skills and skills naive trainees using self-directed learning with a take-home laparoscopic trainer box. So here's a picture of the box and what they might do with it. You can kind of see the little the tools there, and they're going to be moving those pink, purple, green cylinders from the pegs on the left to the pegs on the right. Here's actually an example of what they were asked to do. And so this was to medical students and procedure naive PGY1 OBGYN residents. They went to an initial intro session to show them how the trainer could be used. Then they were given 10 minutes to practice. And then they were given these instructions. Prior to the practice, they were given these instructions as to what they needed to do, which basically meant move the pegs from the left side of the board to the right side of the board, and then move them back from the right side of the board to the left side of the board. And if you drop it, make sure your camera's on and you pick it back up. When they would do this, they were asked to film themselves. And then the filming was de-identified. And it was then reviewed for how long it took the individual to complete the task. And then they sent them home with the task trainer for 3 weeks. And then they tested them again after the 3 weeks. And what you found here is that, and I don't think this is totally surprising, is that the more they practiced, the better they got at this. Their score went down because their time went down to complete the task. And the number of practice sessions they had also correlated with score improvement. Now, just an interesting aside, I think you'll appreciate this, is that they did find some statistically significant findings in participants who had previously played musical instruments. That first score, if they were given the intro to how to use these boxes, was 64 seconds faster than everyone else. So just those fine motor skills were so much better in those who plays musical instruments. And then they also noticed that participants with 2 or more fine motor skills, and so that could have been playing video games, could have been playing musical instruments, playing sports, they were almost 101 seconds faster than their colleagues who had only 1 or 0 or 1 categories of fine motor skills in that initial session after they were initially introduced to the trainer. So that's something that they considered in all of this, but I thought it was just interesting to note that previous experience does translate here. Now, some other things that they published here is that the change in comfort versus time practice, it increased. That's not surprising. Someone got more comfortable with something the more that they did this. But I think what's most profound here is that after the intro session, they just said, go home and practice. They didn't give them any other advice. And every student just about, and every PGY1, almost all got better. So this is kind of the summary here. Our study overall demonstrated that home laparoscopic trainers can be a useful tool in developing laparoscopic skills in surgically naive trainees, even in the absence of formalized laparoscopic teaching. These home trainers had the potential to help overcome time and access barriers to practicing with traditional simulation centers. They allowed for more frequent practice sessions, which we showed correlated with better skills improvements. And the combination of low-cost equipment, which was nice, self-directed learning environment, and the level of interest in all our participants expressed in using the trainer suggests that the home laparoscopic trainer box can easily be a standard part of undergraduate medical education training and OBGYN residencies starting in the first year. And so I brought this because they just basically gave them an intro, said, go to it, have at it. And maybe it works specific for this, but it may be something that we can apply to other things we want our learners to learn. But this also promotes self-directed learning. And so I can imagine that these learners who were given these boxes are going to be better equipped in the future to train on their own to get better for whatever task it is that they may be training for. And then lastly, I want to talk a little bit about social media and artificial intelligence. I mentioned social media in the chapter briefly, but it has grown so much more since then. And it still remains a great way to forage for key information. I know I do this myself through Twitter or X, where you can follow certain individuals and they will promote things that are relevant or interesting of the day. And just on my feed, I can see all the things that I can see a lot of things that I think are interesting. So that's a great way to do this. But you name it, Facebook can do this, others can do this. And social media has grown in a way that I know a lot of our students are using it, and faculty are using it in the same way. It's also a way to promote STL beyond the classroom. If you have a large following, you can promote STL in that way, but also by promoting and forwarding on key and interesting topics as many do. Now, artificial intelligence, now that's the last one. And I'll be honest with you, there wasn't a whole lot in the literature on this yet. And I think it's coming. And I think part of the struggles is right now, if you think about the chatbots early on, um, they would give us incorrect information. They would hallucinate. They would come up with things that were purely fictional. And so the reliability on them initially was suspect, but they've gotten better and better. And so now, and even then, they're more than just a glorified Google search for the students. Because I mean, a student can actually go into one of the chatbots and say, hey, create me a 10-question quiz on this topic. And it'll do that. Now, again, whether they're all accurate and correct, we're still working through that. But they can create their own assessment materials, which is really, really interesting. And students can submit their own things, like their own materials, like a paper that they've written for feedback from these chatbots and other artificial intelligence modalities to help coach them. And so self-directed learning, in my opinion, is only going to grow and expand with the expansion of AI, because there's going to be so many more opportunities that we never thought of for students to go seek feedback and seek ways to learn that don't even currently exist as we speak today. And so not a lot out there. There are a few things about how AI could be abused, where students may use AI and they may potentially convey it as their own work, and there needs to be rules around that. But I found more rules about how to use AI than I did about how it can be effectively used for STL at this time. And so that's my quick summary. Thanks for listening to me about my chapter. I'd like to open it up to questions, thoughts, anything else anyone would like to discuss here today. Thank you, Gary. I don't know if you have anything else you want me to talk about regarding the chapter.
No, not at all. It was a nice overview, and I'm glad you included some of the stuff about AI and large language models, because it's the wave of the future. And even though some of us grew up with the Terminator and Skynet, it's here, and we have to learn to adapt and help the students to understand how to use it as well. But even for those of us in our careers, it's helpful to learn these things and continue learning. So we're open to any and all questions right now. So if anybody has questions, please raise your hand, and Chad, if you want to stop sharing, we can
Yeah, that's a good
see
idea.
everybody.
Oh, there you go. Nice. Thank you. I will say, I mean, if this interests you, or you have someone at your institution that's interested in this, there are so many opportunities in lifelong learning, self-directed learning. It just isn't something that has been well studied or well researched. So I think the opportunities here are tremendous. Clearly, there are gaps.
Sounds like a project for Christine Nazara.
Right. We could talk, huh? Yeah.
I mean, I was thinking about that because Chad and I do have an initiative with a sort of evaluative components. We could certainly think about if that could come down the line. I guess one of the things I was thinking about is, we can talk about this and we can encourage this among ourselves and among our faculty, but I'm almost wondering how do we keep that drive to consistently grow as learners when sometimes the motivation just isn't there? How do we push ourselves to be motivated consistently, and how do we encourage that in our learners and our faculty when we know that, like, how you experience medical training and work can vacillate? I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, Chad.
I do think, the role modeling is important. I do think that's something that, at least a cultural shift that we talk about this. And so I've tried to do it when I teach on rounds, that I talk about the resources that I use and what I do when I study, how I study, all of those things that I would never have thought about talking about before. But just to give some examples for the learners to say, look, all right, I like what Dr. Miller did there. What he said he does there, that's nuts. I'm not going to ever do that. And so they can kind of pick and choose. But I also wanted to hear from them, to hear it from me, that maybe they'll adopt that, and then they'll continue this discussion amongst others. But I think there's a huge cultural change opportunity here, Christina, because it was definitely not a part of the training I received when going through.
So
That's my thought on that.
I was going to say, do you think that being somewhat vulnerable and transparent when you're on rounds or working with the students and admitting that you don't know something well would be a good thing to help motivate them because it always seems like we I mean we fear not knowing something and looking stupid in front of the students, but at the same time, it almost seems like we need to get over that and make sure that we are being transparent about the fact that we aren't clear on something and need to look it up ourselves. And that might help them to see that that's a good model to follow.
I agree 100%. I try to do that. Can't say that I always do, but I try. But I agree, but I think that's a great suggestion, Gary, and I think that's something we should encourage and promote, for sure.
Yeah. Dr. Miller, something I'd like to add. This is Dennis Baker in
Yes,
Tallahassee.
so please.
And one of the things that I think self-directed learning is dependent on is good self-assessment, valid
Right.
and reliable. And I just find it very interesting that if you would take any sample of evaluation instruments where they evaluate the student on clinical rotations and look for this item that the preceptors would grade the student on, and it's their ability to self-assess accurately.
Mhm.
I will guarantee you that you will not find even, I'm going to challenge, somebody can challenge me on this, and I hope they do. I don't think you're going to find even one school that actually evaluates their student on a clinical clerkship on the item, saying something like, this student has a great ability to self-assess accurately. And I guess I'm just wondering, like, how do we come this far and miss that much?
I think I don't know. I don't know. And maybe, and I agree with you that I bet you would not find a school that's doing that.
Yeah.
Even though I feel like we do a pretty good job with some assessment
Mhm.
here at St. Louis University. We're not doing that. We're not asking that of our clinicians. But I think that's a really good question is we all think this is important. We all know it's important. And then even in those research studies, people say that they want more of this, they want to do it. But there's a huge chasm between what we want and what we are able to do right now. And
Yeah.
why, I don't know. And maybe it's been lack of prioritization. There probably needs to be a cultural shift. Maybe we need a
Well,
big,
it's so fascinating to me that one colleague of mine, I mentioned this to her, and she said, "Well, we don't evaluate the students on their ability to self-assess because we know they can't do it accurately." And then I said, "Well, wait a minute, isn't that the reason to do it?"
yes.
You know,
Well, and it's fascinating though with the introduction of using independent or individualized learning plans and things like that. I mean, that is a form of self-assessment, and um, so it almost begs the question of if this is actually one of the key components of self-directed learning. I'm sort of surprised that Chad, you and I both have just gone through this with the LCME, that they haven't been um, basically spanking the schools for not evaluating that in some way, shape, or form, because that is a critical part of it.
mhm.
That's what I was gonna. Hi, everyone. John Zarek. I'm sorry I was late. I had another meeting. Hi, Chad. Yeah, I was gonna theorize it has to do with LCME
Mhm.
because, I raised this question before. It could be in someone who focuses mostly in the preclinical phase. There is a standard or whatever, I don't know the numbers, but on self-directed learning, but it's only on preclinical phase.
6.3.
And I've asked before, I said, well, why isn't there, why don't they have to prove it for the clerkships as well? Oh, well, it just happens. It's happening.
But back to
Yeah.
your point, I mean, this may be where Dennis is right, where maybe that's incomplete. And, that feedback on self-assessment and a little bit more of that. And to Gary's point, maybe that comes in during those clerkship years. And you're right, it does seem incomplete that it is only the 3 clerkships.
Yeah, and students do a good job of faking out the faculty, I think, or because, like just in years 1 and 2, you just look at any school and where the students have to be videotaped interviewing a patient and then sit down and self-assess before they sit down with somebody to give them some feedback as an outside person. And what the students will tend to do is that they tend to gather up as a kind of a crowd, so to speak, and they almost like refuse to watch that video and self-assess, and they kind of talk the faculty out of it, so it's interesting to watch that. And the faculty just sort of like, just okay. I'm sure John's seen that too.
All right.
Good.
Any other questions? If not, thank you again,
Thank
Chad.
you for attending, everyone. I appreciate it.
Yes, it's been a great session, and the recording will be up on the Alliance for Clinical Education website as soon as it gets done processing. So if you want to watch it again or share it with some people who couldn't make it, it'll be there. So thanks again, everyone.
Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.